The village of Muta Nyoka sat curled between two withered hills like a secret the earth had tried to forget. It did not appear on any map, and those who passed through rarely remembered its name. The wind that drifted across its crooked thatch roofs always carried the scent of wood smoke, old rain, and something else, something too subtle to name, like the feeling of being watched by something just beyond the trees. Time in Muta Nyoka seemed to move sideways or backwards or not at all. Chickens still ran loose in the red clay alleys, elders still sat under the udala trees, and the sun seemed to rise reluctantly, casting long hesitant shadows before it dared to warm the village. The people of Muta Nyoka held their breath more often than they knew. They were proud of their ways, rituals passed down from ancestors with names too sacred to utter aloud. They kept time not with calendars or clocks, but with signs: the falling of the black ibis feathers, the way the moon tilted during harvest season, or the whisper of reeds near the old pond. There were no written rules, yet everyone knew what could be spoken and what must be swallowed. Children were taught early not to play near certain trees, not to whistle at night, and never to ask about the hut behind the elder's well. That hut. It crouched at the farthest edge of the village like something the soil had rejected but couldn't quite spit out. Its roof sagged like tired shoulders. The walls, made of baked mud and rough straw, looked perpetually wet even during the dry months. Vines had grown over it, twisting like veins, and some said they pulsed slightly like something was moving beneath. The door had long since vanished. No one knew whether it had rotted away or been taken, but in its place hung a dark cloth that never stirred, no matter how fierce the wind blew. Even the animals kept their distance. Goats that wandered too close stopped eating for days. Dogs barked at it in the night but never approached. Cats simply refused to look at it, which the villagers believed to be the worst omen of all. The air around the hut felt different, heavier, as if it were thick with invisible hands pressing down. The ground there was never dry. It stayed damp, sometimes even warm, as though the earth itself was exhaling slowly from some hidden ancient mouth. The elders called it the whispering ground. Children who asked too many questions about it were sent to bed without stories. Stories, after all, were sacred in Muta Nyoka. They were not just entertainment, they were warnings wrapped in rhythm, protection hidden in proverb. And so the village told other stories instead. Stories of clever hares and foolish hunters, of spirits that hid in trees and wise women who could speak to lightning. But in the hush between tales, in the moments before sleep when firelight flickered on the hut walls, everyone thought of it, the place where the earth breathed. The oldest people in the village, those whose teeth were long gone and whose skin had turned to thin paper, remembered a time before the hut existed. They spoke rarely, and when they did, their voices cracked like dry bark. Some said the hut was built on the ruins of something older, a shrine maybe, or a grave. Others claimed it simply appeared one morning after a blood-red moon, fully formed, as though it had been placed there by something that did not walk on two legs. No one agreed on its origin. But all agreed on one thing: the land beneath it was not meant to be disturbed. Once, long ago, a group of boys dared each other to sleep beside it. Only one returned. His hair had turned gray overnight. He never spoke again and died 3 weeks later, staring wide-eyed at something only he could see. Since then, the hut had been left alone, and those who passed near it did so with silence in their throats and prayers in their pockets. They said a curse lay beneath it. Not a curse like in the storybooks with witches and muttered spells, but something slower, deeper, more patient. It was the kind of curse that made crops fail without warning, that sent mothers into labor too early, that made men dream of drowning even when they'd never seen a river. It did not strike like lightning, it spread like rot. And the elders, protectors of memory and keepers of the old songs, believed the hut to be its mouth. Once every generation the ground would grow restless. The wind would hum low and mean. The sky would turn the color of spoiled milk. And someone, always someone misunderstood or unloved, would be blamed for it. The villagers would gather beneath the udala tree, speak of balance and tradition, and call for sacrifice. But no one spoke of what happened inside the hut. Even among themselves in the hush of twilight, they avoided the topic. Fear in Muta Nyoka was not loud. It was quiet, dignified, wrapped in smiles and silence. When the wind changed direction or the animals grew agitated, people swept their porches harder, fed the fire longer, and avoided eye contact with the past. No one dared speak the names of those who had vanished. To name them was to invite the curse back into your throat. Still, the hut remained, growing older but never collapsing. Every attempt to tear it down failed. One man, bold with youth and too much palm wine, once tried to set it ablaze. The fire caught for a moment, just long enough for the wind to howl, but then extinguished itself without burning even a single straw. The man was found the next day at the edge of the village, eyes wide, mouth stuffed with black feathers. The village healer, a woman named Olum, often passed the hut on her way to gather herbs. She would never speak of it directly, but sometimes she muttered prayers under her breath as she walked by, and other times she placed a white stone near its threshold. When asked why, she only said, "The ground remembers kindness." And so, the people remembered the rules. They did not build too close. They kept their voices low at night. They taught their children to be respectful of things they didn't understand, and to never mock the whispers in the dark. Because the ground beneath Muta Nyoka was not dead. It stirred sometimes, especially in the wet months when the soil turned to soup and the earthworms climbed to the surface. Some said the hut was breathing. Others said it was something deeper, older, something dreaming. They spoke of a time, perhaps long ago, perhaps not yet come, when the earth would open its mouth and speak the truth it had swallowed for generations. The elders warned that such a time would be terrible and beautiful all at once. That when the chains spoke again they would not ask questions, they would demand answers. And no one, not even the most pious, would be safe from their judgment. Until then the village waited. It waited with its cracked drums and faded masks. With its careful rituals and silent fears. With its children taught to watch the shadows and its mothers who sang songs with meanings older than memory. And the hut remained. Still, dark, breathing beneath the silence. Esina was not born like other children. The midwife who delivered her said she came out in silence, eyes open, watching. She did not cry for the first 2 days, not even when slapped or bathed in cold water. Her mother, a slender woman named Nyaya, said it was a blessing, that the spirits had given her a daughter who listened before she spoke. Her father, okay, only nodded, cradling the baby like a fragile prophecy. Even as a child, Esina was different. She didn't run with the others, didn't shriek with laughter or cry over broken toys. Instead she watched. She would sit by the old termite mound for hours, listening to the hum of the earth. When the wind carried stories from the marketplace, she heard every whispered insult, every lie passed from one trader to another. She stored these things, the small cruelties and gentle truths, like a gourd collecting rainwater. When she did speak, her words were careful, slow, almost deliberate, like someone arranging leaves into patterns only she understood. People in the village said she had her mother's wide, moonlit eyes, but her father's silence. Some said it like a compliment. Others did not. When Esina was 10, her world ended without warning. One morning her parents simply vanished. They had gone to the river to gather water before sunrise. The clay pots were found floating by the bank, unbroken. No footprints, no blood, no signs of struggle. Just absence. Just silence. The villagers called it fate. The elders said perhaps the river had taken them as payment for something they'd done or forgotten to do. No one looked too hard. No one asked too many questions. Esina was sent to live with her aunt, Mbale, her mother's elder sister, a woman with skin like dry bark and hands that never stopped moving. Mbale was not cruel in the usual way. She never hit Esina, never shouted. But her cruelty was quieter, sharper, like a thorn that hides underfoot. She gave Esina the hardest tasks. Fetching water from the far spring, scrubbing soot from pots until her fingers bled, sitting in the dark to grind millet long after the moon had risen. She always found fault, always said Esina was too slow, too strange, too much like the ones who had disappeared. Bale fed her less than she fed her goats. She made Esina sleep by the cooking hearth, where the floor was always cold and the smoke never quite faded. She locked away her late sister's belongings, forbidding Esina to touch or even speak of them. When Esina once asked for her mother's necklace, a simple charm made of glass beads, Bale slapped her hand away and said, "Your mother left nothing behind. Not even her shadow." Years passed and Esina grew. She was slender and long-limbed, with eyes that never blinked too fast. She moved like wind over grass, unnoticed until she chose otherwise. She had no friends. Other children avoided her, not out of malice, but out of something closer to confusion. Esina didn't laugh when they did, didn't run from imaginary monsters. Instead, she watched the ants march along the compound wall, studied the way old men stirred their porridge, listened to the wind rustle through the elder tree leaves like it was telling her secrets. And the village began to change how they looked at her. When the rains came late 2 seasons in a row, some blamed Esina. When goats miscarried or chickens laid soft, useless eggs, her name was muttered beneath breath. A boy who tried to tease her fell from a mango tree and broke his arm the next day. His mother said it was punishment. A girl who spilled palm oil on Esina's dress later lost her voice for 3 days. Her grandmother said the spirits had spoken. No one had proof, of course. But in Muta Nyoka, proof was less important than pattern. People began to avoid her gaze. Traders no longer greeted her when she passed. Children made signs of protection when she drew near. Bale did not defend her. If anything, she encouraged it. "She walks like someone not fully here," she said once at the marketplace, loudly enough for all to hear. "Like something waiting to become." Asina never argued, never protested. She carried her tasks out with quiet precision, her face unreadable. But inside, something had begun to curl, not anger, not sadness, but a kind of knowing. A knowledge that she was not meant to belong, at least not in the way others did. She had begun to sense the cracks beneath the village's polished customs, the unease they buried under ritual and story. She heard it in the way they paused before mentioning her parents. In the tremble in Bale's voice when thunder cracked in the middle of the night. They feared her because they feared what they had done, or failed to do. And Asina, always listening, always watching, began to understand something even deeper. That fear had a sound. A hum just beneath speech, like a drum hidden beneath silence. It was the sound people made when they saw a truth too heavy to carry but too late to bury. She heard it when they looked at her. And each time she heard it, it grew louder. It began with a cough. A small sound, insignificant at first, buried in the hum of everyday life. Bale's son, Kalu, had always been healthy, strong, loud, restless like fire without a hearth. He chased goats through the thorny fields, climbed every tree within reach, and wrestled other boys in the dust until their laughter turned to grunts. But that cough did not leave him. By the second night, it grew deeper, wetter, like something was pulling at his lungs from inside. His forehead burned, his skin turned the color of palm ash, and he began to mutter things in his sleep that made even his grandmother cross herself twice. Bale tried everything. She boiled bitter herbs, burned salt, whispered old prayers passed down through generations. She sent for Olum, the village healer, who arrived with quiet eyes and hands stained red with bark. Olum placed one hand on Kalu's chest and closed her eyes. After a long silence, she said only, "Something unseen has touched him." That was all Bale needed to hear. By morning, the rumor had spread like wildfire through the village. Bale's son had been cursed. And there was only one name on everyone's tongue: Asina. It did not take much to convince them. Her silence had long been mistaken for secrecy. Her eyes too still. Her footsteps too soft. She had been blamed before, but never with such fervor. This time there was a child suffering to fuel the flame. Mothers clutched their babies tighter when she passed. Men spat in the dust behind her. Children peered from behind doorposts with wide, uncertain eyes. Bale didn't approach Asina directly. Instead, she went to the elders under the Udala tree. She stood there barefoot, ash on her forehead, and spoke with a voice that trembled just enough to be believable. "My son lies between life and death," she said, "and the one who walks with shadows lives in my own house." There were 5 elders in the council, each old enough to remember the last sacrifice. They exchanged long glances before nodding solemnly. No one spoke of the hut, not yet, but it hung in the air like a storm cloud waiting to crack. Asina was summoned to stand before the village. They gathered at dusk, just before the moon rose. A fire was lit in the center of the gathering circle. Its flames twisted upward, flickering yellow and red against the night. The wind was still. Even the animals seemed to quiet. Asina stood alone, barefoot in the red dust, her hands by her sides, eyes steady. Bale stood across from her, eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights. Kalu had been left at home, too weak to move. His absence was felt like a question no one dared ask. The lead elder stepped forward, holding a long, thin stick made of ebony wood. He pointed toward the fire and spoke the words of the old trial, a ritual not seen in many seasons. "The innocent are untouched by the spirits of flame. If you are clean in heart and soul, the fire will turn from you." A silence fell. Asina was told to step close to the flames. She did. The fire cracked. Its light bathed her face in gold. She looked straight ahead, unflinching. The wind moved through the trees. A single nightbird called from somewhere in the distance. And then the fire leaned toward her. The flames bent, as if pulled by something unseen, reaching out in long fingers toward her chest. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Some stepped back. Others made signs of protection. The elders said nothing, but their eyes hardened. The verdict was silent, but final. She was guilty. Bale did not cry out in triumph. She only lowered her head as though the truth had cost her more than she'd wanted to pay. The sentence was immediate. "She will be taken at first light," said the eldest among them, his voice flat, empty of emotion. "The ground beneath the hut remembers how to hold what must be hidden." No one protested. No one defended her. Not even Olam. Asina said nothing. She did not weep, did not plead. She only looked at the fire one last time, as though trying to understand what it had seen in her. They bound her hands in front of her with rough rope and led her to Mbale's home, where she was locked in a storage room overnight. A single guard sat outside the door, chewing bitter cola and refusing to meet her eyes. The moon slid overhead in silence. Inside, Asina sat with her knees drawn to her chest, listening. She heard no cries from Bale's hut. She heard no prayers from her old neighbors. But from far off, just barely, beneath the hush of wind and insects, she thought she heard something else. A faint rattle. A clink of metal. A whisper not made by any human mouth. The sound of chains. Calling her home. At dawn, the village moved like a body holding its breath. No drums played. No market opened. Even the birds seemed reluctant to sing. The sky was a pale, sour gray, as if it, too, was unsure of what was about to happen. A small procession formed, the elders at the front, guards with ash-smeared faces at the flanks, and behind them, Asina. Her hands were still bound. Her feet bare. She walked without resistance, eyes straight ahead, like one already in conversation with fate. They led her to the edge of the village, to the hut. It was smaller than she remembered, but it felt enormous, like it pulled the sky inward. Vines clung to the walls like veins, wet with dew that shimmered like blood. The air was heavy, dense. The cloth that hung where the door should be fluttered once, not from the wind but as if it had exhaled. Asina did not blink. The guards pulled the cloth aside. Behind it, darkness yawned open like a mouth. There was no visible floor, only a ladder made of bone white wood descending into shadow. One of the elders nodded. The guards took Asina by the arms and forced her forward. Her fingers grazed the ladder. It was warm. They pushed her down. The ladder creaked beneath her weight but did not break. The light faded fast, swallowed by a thickness that was more than air. It was not simply dark, it was deep. Each step downward felt like time stretched. She stopped counting after the 30th rung. When her bare foot finally touched the floor, it sank slightly into something damp and cold. Stone. Something else. Then the trapdoor above slammed shut. Silence. The room smelled of rust and rot and something older, like forgotten breath. The walls were uneven and curved, as if carved by hands too large for human fingers. Strange symbols covered every surface, some shallow, others gouged so deep they wept black liquid. Bones lay scattered in the corners, not fresh but not dust. Some looked human. Others didn't. The chains hung from the far wall. 4 thick iron loops embedded in stone, with links as wide as her wrist, coated in grime. They didn't shimmer. They pulsed. Faintly. As if alive. Asina stepped toward them, unsteady. She was not asked to put them on. The moment she was close enough, the chains snapped forward with a speed that defied their weight. They coiled around her wrists and ankles, tight but not painful. As if claiming her, not punishing her. Her body trembled. The cold seeped into her bones. Water dripped from the ceiling in slow, deliberate drops. Each one echoed like a whisper in a cavernous throat. Asina tried to stay strong, but she was still a girl. Still alone. Still flesh. She cried. Not loudly. There were no screams, no wails. Just quiet tears, sliding down her face and soaking into the collar of her shift. She didn't sob. Her shoulders didn't shake. She simply let the sorrow leave her eyes, one drop at a time, until it joined the wetness beneath her feet. She closed her eyes. Time passed, minutes or hours she couldn't tell. There was no sun here, no moon. Only breath. Only damp. Only silence. And then, it began. The chains shifted. Not a lot, just enough for her to feel it. A small tug at the left wrist. Then another at her ankle. She opened her eyes. The room was the same, but the air felt thicker now. Charge. Then came the rattle. Soft. Barely audible. Like metal breathing. It started behind her, then beside her, then beneath. The links moved not all at once but in rhythm. A pattern. And then she heard it. Her name. Asina. Barely a breath, no louder than wind through dry reeds, but she heard it. It didn't come from the walls. Not from a mouth. It came from the chains. She froze. The whisper came again, not just her name now but a tone. A voice layered over itself. Many. Female. Familiar. It didn't say words, not yet, but it hummed in a way that felt like memory. Like grief. Like calling home. Asina's breathing slowed. The chains warmed slightly around her wrists, just enough to feel like fingers instead of metal. She was no longer alone. The room was no longer empty. The darkness had shape now, the kind seen only with closed eyes. And in that shape something moved. Not toward her, but within her. Her tears stopped. Her fear thinned. She did not understand what was happening. But a part of her, deep, ancient, buried, recognized it. She was not in a prison. She was in a mouth that had waited generations to speak. And it had chosen her name first. The first night the chains whispered her name. The second night they began to speak. It didn't begin as speech in the ordinary sense. Not words spoken from a mouth, not phrases shaped by breath. It was vibration, murmur, rhythm, like wind finding music through the hollow of a bone. But Asina heard them. Not with her ears exactly, but in her spine, her chest, the backs of her eyes. The chains were speaking. And they had so much to say. She lay against the cold stone wall, wrists heavy with iron, and listened. She had nothing else to do. No sun, no food, no company. Just dripping water and ancient metal that seemed to breathe and dream and remember. The chains told her of women. One had been named Maro, taken from her bed at 15. They said she had looked too long at the moon during harvest season. Said the crops failed because her eyes drew the water away. They shaved her head and burned her clothes before they dragged her to this place. She had screamed until her throat bled. When her voice finally broke, the chains had spoken to her too. Another was called Temu. She had once healed a chief's wife with the wrong herb, or perhaps it was the right herb but too late. Either way the woman died and Temu was blamed. They chained her here in silence. She bit off her own tongue before the first week ended. The chains remembered the copper taste of her defiance. Some names were long forgotten, their stories buried under time and dust, but the chains remembered. Every wrist, every ankle, every heartbeat that had touched them left something behind. Sorrow did not fade here. It fossilized. But one voice among them spoke clearest. Lolly. She came into Asina's thoughts like the scent of a forgotten flower. Soft at first like a dream. Then stronger, sharper. Her voice was clearer than the others. More human. More angry. Lolly had been accused a century ago, maybe more. She had dared to ask the elders why only women were punished when crops failed, why men who beat their wives were never chained, why dreams of fire were treated as omens only when women dreamed them. They called her dangerous. Said she spoke too boldly. That she stirred disobedience among girls. One night, the river flooded without warning and a child drowned. They blamed Lolly. They called her cursed. She was 17 when they dragged her here. Her chains had once been worn by a goat thief, she said. A man who had stolen out of hunger. She laughed at that, even in memory, that they used recycled iron for righteous punishment. At least I share something with a man, she whispered once in Asina's ear. Even if it's just rust. Lolly's chain was the one coiled around Asina's right wrist. At night, Lolly's voice filled the dark with stories, not just of her own pain, but of others she had come to know in the years since her death. Women buried in shallow graves, women drowned for touching the wrong tree, girls silenced before they ever had a chance to speak. And all their stories were tucked into the metal, like veins of grief running through the iron. Asina listened. Each word Lolly spoke etched itself into her memory. Each tale became part of a growing map, a tapestry of injustice stitched from centuries of betrayal. These were not just sad stories. They were confessions, warnings, testimonies. The truth no one above dared write in song or proverb. The truth the soil had swallowed. The chains shifted when Lolly spoke, tightening gently as though drawing attention, urging Asina to remember every detail. And she did. She began to repeat the names to herself in the dark. First silently, then under her breath. Moro, Temu, Nianda, Ebel, Ado, Lolly. She pictured each of them, gave them faces, voices, breath. She imagined what they might have said if given a platform, a place to speak without fear. She imagined how the village would have changed had it listened. But no one had listened. Except her. And now the chains were louder. Clear. They no longer whispered. They spoke in full sentences, sometimes layered, sometimes in unison, like a choir buried beneath the earth. The voices wove in and out of one another, painting the past across the dark like smoke on stone. Asina felt something changing inside her. It wasn't just that she was learning their stories, it was that their stories were becoming hers. Their pain rooted itself in her chest like a seed splitting open. Their fury curled in her fingers. Their shame melted into her skin. And beneath all of it was one unspoken truth, pulsing through the chains like blood. They had all been innocent. Asina no longer cried. No longer counted the days. There were no days here anyway. Just the darkness. Just the chains. Just the truth. And she was remembering every word. At first, the transformation was slow, like roots shifting beneath soil. Asina didn't notice it immediately. She still flinched at every creak above her, still shivered when the damp chill clawed at her back. But something inside her had begun to stir, not with fear but with something older, something firmer. The whispers of the chains had grown familiar, almost comforting in their rhythm. She no longer cried herself to sleep. Now she listened, and slowly she began to answer. Her voice at first cracked, hoarse from disuse and despair. But the chains paused when she spoke, as if surprised, as if remembering that they were not alone in their telling. When she said Lali's name aloud, the entire subterranean room seemed to breathe. The air thickened, warmed. And then the whispers returned, more urgent, more vibrant. She began to repeat their stories aloud, word for word, until her voice no longer trembled. She recited the tale of Ephra, whose own brother cast her below for seeing what she should not have seen. She murmured the fate of Mbaya, a healer blamed for a drought brought by the skies. Night after night, Asina collected their names like precious seeds. She stored them in the hollows of her memory. They gave her purpose. They gave her strength. On the 7th night she dreamed. She was standing on red earth, beneath a sky that pulsed with lightning. Surrounding her were women, scores of them, each cloaked in ash and light. They didn't speak, but they reached for her hands, pressed warm palms against her shoulders. Asina couldn't explain how she knew them. But in the way their eyes met hers, she understood. These were the women of the chains. They had lived and suffered and been forgotten. Until now. She woke with a start, her breath catching in her throat. The room was brighter, not with torchlight for none existed below, but with a dull, crimson glow pulsing through the dirt floor. The chains trembled, not violently but like a heartbeat. Asina pressed her palms flat against the earth. It was warm. For the first time since her punishment she didn't feel cold. The next day, when the guards came to toss down her usual half-rotten yam and brackish water, Asina didn't flinch or crawl back into the corner. She stood in full view. The guards didn't meet her gaze, they never did, but one of them hesitated longer than usual. Perhaps it was the way she stood, calm and unafraid. Or maybe it was the flickering light that danced around her ankles, too quick to be seen properly, too unnatural to ignore. Asina waited until the hatch slammed shut again. She stared at the bone carvings etched into the stone walls. She hadn't noticed before how they pulsed too, faintly, with the same heat. She traced one of the carvings, the spiral pattern used in the old village to mark sacred burial grounds. She whispered the names again. Lali. For. Baya. 100 more. The chains responded. They tightened around her wrists, not to hurt but to embrace. The whispering grew more rhythmic, almost like a chant. This time Asina spoke louder. Her voice echoed strangely, bouncing back not just from stone but from time itself. The names she spoke became songs, the words taking form in the air like breath on cold glass. Her fear, the heavy cloak she had worn since childhood, seemed to lift. In its place came clarity. She began to move differently. No longer hunched. No longer trembling. She walked the small room, dragging the chains like a queen trailing her robes. When she spoke now, the walls seemed to listen. When she slept, the dreams deepened. In one, she stood beside a river made of tears. The women stood behind her and together they cupped the water, letting it flow through their hands like oil. Memory, one finally spoke, her voice echoing in Asina's bones. Is stronger than fire. And yours now carries ours. Asina awoke with her palms wet. Something inside her had turned. She was still shackled, still buried beneath a hut feared by even the wild dogs. But she no longer felt trapped. She was not alone. She was not broken. She began to test her voice, singing, humming, chanting in old dialects she didn't know she remembered. Sometimes the earth beneath her feet trembled. Once, a crack opened in the wall, revealing a long-forgotten mark, a crescent moon etched in charcoal. She pressed her fingers against it and the chains sang. On the 12th night she laughed, truly laughed, for the first time in years. It startled even the chains. Her laughter echoed like a drumbeat through the room, bouncing off stone and shadow. It sounded like freedom, like rebellion, like prophecy. When the villagers passed the hut that morning, several stopped. Something about the air had shifted. A child claimed he heard a melody coming from beneath the earth. An elder paused, sensing a rhythm in the soil that hadn't been there in generations. Asina below listened. The chains whispered again, not of pain this time but of rising. They told her the next story would be her own. She nodded, whispering back, then let them listen. The village of Muta Nyoka stirred with a discomfort that no one could name. It began slowly, almost silently, like a breeze that brushes the skin but cannot be seen. Yet even the birds seemed to avoid the rooftops now, and the goats bleated as if sensing an invisible pulse beating beneath the soil. The elders gathered more frequently in the evenings, leaning on canes and tradition, murmuring about balance and omens, their eyes flicking toward the hut that no one dared mention aloud. Children woke screaming in the middle of the night, clutching their bellies or chests, describing dreams they couldn't fully understand. Some spoke of a girl with silver eyes and lips that never moved, floating above the village fires. Others drew strange symbols in the dirt, lines and curves that neither parent nor priest recognized, but which sparked unease in the pit of the stomach. One child, the blacksmith's son, drew a spiral with jagged teeth and said it was the mouth of the ground that would open again. That very night, his father's forge collapsed inward like it had been chewed from below. Women began waking with voices in their ears, voices not of their husbands or neighbors, but softer, ancient, echoing in tones that felt more like breath than sound. One of the midwives claimed she heard singing near the whispering hut, low, mournful, like a mother calling to a child who had gone too far into the forest. Her eyes darted constantly after that, and she wouldn't enter any home without smudging ash on her forehead and muttering, "She listens now. She listens from below." Bale, who once walked through the village with a chin high as a mountain goat, had changed most dramatically. Her eyes, once sharp with cruelty, now twitched at every shadow. She spoke to herself often, rocking in place, muttering phrases that made no sense to anyone but sent chills through whoever happened to overhear. She accused her neighbors of hiding snakes under her doorstep. She tied calabashes filled with goat blood to her windows. One morning she painted her entire front door in white chalk, weeping and scratching at her own arms, claiming she had seen Asina's face in her cooking pot, eyes open, mouth moving though no sound had emerged. No one said it directly, but fear had begun to bind the village together, a brittle rope of shared superstition and barely suppressed guilt. They tried to distract themselves with dances, prayers, and offerings. Drums were played longer into the nights, and fires burned higher, as if they could drown out whatever it was that stirred in the silence. But even those flames began to falter. Firewood refused to burn cleanly. Smoke curled into unfamiliar shapes, faces some claimed, and one night, it refused to rise entirely, instead pooling on the ground like a thick fog that rolled toward the whispering hut and disappeared beneath it. The elders held secret meetings, the kind not even the younger warriors were invited to. There, in the circle of carved stools and ritual dust, they debated what they dared not name. "Perhaps the ground has changed its hunger," one of them whispered. Another asked, trembling, "What if she listens, and now speaks?" An older woman, her back twisted with time, pounded her cane and said, "She was not meant to break. But if she didn't, the stories return. And with them judgment." Dreams spread through the village like a second sun rising and falling inside people's minds. The butcher saw his mother, long dead, weeping blood and pointing to the hut. The village healer dreamed of flames that refused to consume a girl dressed in chains, standing beneath the hut and smiling. Even the village dogs whimpered in their sleep, scratching at invisible chains with their paws, and howling at the base of the hut during the darkest hour of night. Those who had once avoided the hut began to circle it at a distance, not out of curiosity but compulsion. Some claimed they heard whispers beneath their feet when they passed by. Others said the ground beneath the hut pulsed as though a heart beat beneath it, slow and strong. One man swore he saw a mist curling out from beneath the wooden foundation, trailing behind him for a few steps like a snake before vanishing entirely. Then one morning a woman named Tuma, who had once slapped Asina for stepping too close to her garden, found every single yam in her storehouse rotten, despite being harvested only days before. The rot oddly took the shape of a girl's face. Another family woke to find their compound floor covered in ash and bone dust, arranged in delicate, spiraling patterns none could erase. They tried sweeping, washing, even praying, but the symbols returned each night, more intricate, more precise. Whispers began again, this time about return. She was buried but not forgotten. The ground remembers injustice. Chains do not silence truth. Old sayings, long buried, returned to tongues like forgotten spells. Stories long dismissed as myth began to feel like warnings. And everywhere the villagers looked, in the fire, in their dreams, in their children's drawings, they saw one name resurfacing like breath rising from earth: Asina. Bale locked herself inside her hut and refused food. She screamed at the walls, claiming they were whispering. "You said she'd break," she howled one night, though no one knew who you was. "You said the chains would silence her." Her screams didn't last long. By the time morning came, she was silent, curled in a corner, lips moving as if in prayer, or as if repeating what the chains were now saying to her. And still, beneath the whispering hut, the chains stirred. The first roar of thunder cracked like a warning from the heavens, splitting the sky above Muda Nyoka. The wind howled through the village, scattering dry leaves and upturning cooking pots, while the elders muttered beneath their breath, staring out at the trembling trees. Lightning forked across the dark horizon, slicing the night open. It was not just a storm, it was something older, something waking. Beneath the crumbling hut, Asina sat in silence. The air had shifted, warm and electric. For days, the whispers had grown stronger, now not just stories but instructions, chants in lost languages, songs hummed by the dead, names of women no one dared speak of anymore. The chains around her wrists pulsed with strange heat as though alive. Another strike of lightning lit up the cracks in the earthen walls, revealing the carving she had studied for weeks. Faces, runes, spirals that moved when she blinked. The bones around her no longer felt like remnants of death, but companions in watchful silence. She wasn't afraid of them anymore. As the rain began to pound the earth above, Asina rose. The chains groaned softly, shifting on their own. Not with weight but with intention. They slithered slightly, their rusted lengths tightening, then loosening, like breath. The whispering started again, but this time it wasn't just in her ears. It was in her bones, her blood. Asina, they hissed, 1,000 voices braided into one. She closed her eyes. I am listening, she whispered back. The ground rumbled. Mud dripped from the ceiling. Then the chains began to rise. At first they uncurled slowly, one link at a time as if unsure. But soon they moved with certainty, unwinding themselves from her wrists and ankles with an unnatural grace. They did not fall, they floated. Suspended mid-air, glowing faintly with a silvery blue sheen. Asina did not move. She simply watched, her heartbeat calm, her breath steady. The final clink echoed like a bell tolling. She stood completely free. Yet the silence that followed was not empty, it was full, charged. Her bare feet touched the soaked floor, but she felt no cold. Her skin shimmered faintly in the gloom, not from sweat or storm, but from something else, a fire that had never touched flame. She walked forward. Above her, the hut groaned as the wind battered its rotting walls. Lightning struck nearby, sending a bolt of fire through a tree. The branches lit up like bones ignited. The elders came out of their homes, drawn by the trembling earth and unnatural sounds. Bale screamed from her doorway, pointing toward the hill. It's her, she cried. She's coming. No one moved to comfort her. The villagers gathered, their feet muddy, their eyes wild. They looked toward the cursed hut, only to see it shudder violently. The door burst open as if blown by an invisible gust, but no one came out. Then the chains flew upward. One by one, the iron links shot out from the base of the hut like snakes released from their lair. They wrapped around the roof, the beams, the doorway, and pulled. A scream split the sky, not from any mouth, but from the wood itself as it cracked and splintered. Within moments, the entire structure collapsed inward. Dust and storm rain mingled in the air. Silence. Then came the footsteps. Bare. Soft. But not wet. They made no sound in the mud. Asina stepped out from the ruins. She walked slowly, her gaze not fixed on any person, but through them, as if she saw something far beyond the veil of human sight. Her eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the firelight from the burning tree. The villagers parted. Some fell to their knees. Some whispered prayers. Others simply stood, mouths open, unsure if they were seeing a spirit or a girl. Her white dress, once tattered, now clung to her as if woven by mist. Her hair, tangled and soaked, framed her face like a crown. She walked past them all. Not a single word spoken. Bale stood frozen, her mouth trembling, eyes wide with horror. Asina stopped in front of her for only a breath. The chains behind her dragged through the mud like tails of forgotten serpents. Please, Bale whispered, but her voice cracked, falling into the storm. Asina raised one hand, not to strike but to release. The wind behind her lifted, swirling around them both. Then she walked on. Past the altar. Past the council house. Past the scared faces and into the darkness beyond the village. When she vanished into the storm, the rain stopped. And all that remained in the village was the broken hut, the burnt tree, and chains buried halfway in the earth, as if they had chosen to stay behind and watch. The elders said nothing. The children did not cry. And Bale, once so loud, never spoke again. From that night on, no one in Muda Nyoka dared speak Asina's name after sunset. But they all listened, especially when the wind blew, because sometimes when the thunder rolled just right, they heard the chains whispering again. The night air was thick with an unnatural stillness, as though the trees themselves held their breath. In the center of the village, torches flickered, casting long shadows over the stone paths. No one had summoned her, yet everyone felt her presence before she stepped into the light. The glow in her eyes was gone, replaced by something deeper, something older. Her skin bore the faint impressions of chains no longer visible, but their memory clung to her like dust from another world. Mbale, hunched and trembling, stood in the doorway of her hut, clutching her chest as though her heart would leap out. Her once commanding voice was now a croak, and her eyes darted wildly like a cornered animal. She had not slept since the storm. The sound of the hut collapsing had not left her ears, though no one else heard it. Her mind, once sharp with venom, was now dull with dread. Asina did not speak at first. She simply looked at her aunt, and that silence was louder than any scream. Villagers began to creep out of their homes, barefoot and blinking in disbelief. Some gasped softly. Others clutched charms, unsure whether they witnessed a spirit or a girl. Finally she spoke. Her voice did not rise, did not quiver. It was steady like river water carving through stone. "Where did my parents go, Aunt Mbale?" she asked. Her words did not carry accusation, only clarity. The kind of clarity that burns. Mbale took a step back, mouth opening, closing, lost in a language that had abandoned her. They left," she stammered, but even she could not believe the lie anymore. Asina turned to the gathered crowd. "Do you know how many left and never returned?" Her gaze swept across the faces. Those who had whispered, those who had pointed, those who had watched her chained without a word. Lolly, Nyasha, Binta. Girls accused, buried, forgotten. Their stories are in the chains. I listened. A murmur swept through the crowd. The names were familiar, but distant, like the scent of rain on dry earth. "I do not come to ask for justice," Asina said. "Justice requires permission. I'm not here for that. I am what they became when no one listened. I am their voice, their memory. I am the storm that remembered." Her words cracked the air open. Some dropped to their knees. Others turned their faces to the ground, afraid her eyes would show them their own guilt. Bale whimpered, falling forward. "Please, child. I didn't know." "You did," Asina said, stepping closer. "You knew enough to blame. You knew how to lie. You knew how to keep me silent." Bale wept openly now, rocking herself, whispering old prayers with no power. Asina knelt, not in pity but in witness. "The chains didn't only bind me. They bind this village. Every silence. Every lie. Every sacrifice made to keep fear alive." The torches flickered, and a wind stirred from nowhere, lifting dust and ash into the air. Somewhere in the distance, a drumbeat began, faint, rhythmic, unrelenting. "You may try to forget me," Asina whispered, "but the ground won't. Remembers? And one day it will whisper to your daughters too." She stood and walked past Mbale, who did not follow. No one did. The villagers parted in silence as she passed, their gazes lowered, their breath caught. Asina did not look back. The earth beneath them had changed, and though they did not see it, something had broken free. Not just chains. Not just a girl. But truth. And truth never sleeps. The morning after Asina vanished into the hills, Muta Nyoka felt unnaturally silent. The winds did not stir the banana leaves. The birds that once sang above the village square had moved on. It was as if the land was holding its breath again, but this time not in fear. In reverence. Mbale's hut remained empty, its door swinging open with a groan each time the wind passed through. No one dared to enter it. Villagers said they heard Asina's voice within, murmuring softly from the shadows. No one went close enough to know if it was real. Even the children who once played near the edge of the fields avoided that side of the village. They spoke of a soft hum in the air, a pulse in the earth beneath the ruins of the whispering hut. The hut itself was never rebuilt. For a while, the villagers tried to carry on as they had before, tending to crops, fetching water, and whispering quietly at the market. But Asina's return had shifted something permanent. The stories she told, the names she spoke, had fractured old illusions. The ancestors' crimes, once buried beneath politeness and silence, had been dragged screaming into the open. Elders no longer sat in the center of the village with unquestioned power. Their words were now measured, cautious. Every decision they made felt watched, as if invisible chains now coiled gently around their throats. They did not say Asina's name aloud, but every meeting, every prayer, every glance toward the cursed hilltop carried her weight. Then the children started to be born differently. It was subtle at first. A midwife named Taba noticed a baby girl with a faint gray line across her wrist, like the shadow of a bracelet made by firelight. The girl's mother, a quiet weaver named Keela, had dreamed of a glowing hut the night before her daughter's birth. In her dream, a girl with pale eyes had handed her a chain and whispered, "She will not forget." Other babies followed, each bearing the same mark, shaped like a broken loop, as if a shackle had once rested there. Some on their left wrist, some on the right, but all identical. At first, the villagers feared the marks were curses, signs of punishment. But the children grew strong, quick to learn, and unafraid of the places that once made adults shiver. They walked freely near the ruins. Some even sang to the wind there. When one child, a boy named Moro, fell into the well during the dry season, he didn't cry for help. He whispered, and the water rose to meet him. Rumors began to turn into belief. Someone built a small circle of stones where the whispering hut once stood. They placed bits of broken pottery and rusted nails inside, not as offerings but as reminders. Others brought carvings of women's faces, each different, each with eyes closed in silence. Someone added a woven cloth with a looped chain stitched in red. A shrine was born. It had no name at first, but over time, people began calling it the Circle of Chains. Then, the Place of Voices. Eventually, it became simply the Spirits of Truth. People came from nearby villages, drawn by stories that traveled like smoke through the trees. Some came to confess their secrets aloud, hoping to be forgiven. Others came only to listen. A few swore they heard whispers in return, voices of women long gone, voices that never forgot. One woman arrived in silence, her face veiled in mourning black. She had banished her daughter years ago after a dream told her the girl would bring ruin. At the shrine, the woman placed her daughter's shoes on the stones and whispered her name. That night, the woman's own chains fell away in her sleep. She woke up weeping and finally at peace. No one ever saw Asina again. Some say she wandered into the hills and joined the spirits. Others believe she walks through distant villages in the form of an old woman with quiet eyes, listening for injustice like dry leaves underfoot. The children with the chain-marked wrists sometimes dream of her, always standing at the edge of a river of fire, always smiling, always silent. A traveling hunter once claimed to have seen her. He said she stood at the crest of a ridge as the sun set behind her, holding a staff of bone and ash. She looked at him without fear and turned into mist. No one believed him, but they wrote his story on the shrine wall anyway. In Muta Nyoka, no one is chained beneath huts anymore. When someone is accused now, they are taken to the shrine. They must stand within the circle and speak their truth. The people gather and listen not just with their ears but with their hearts. No flames, no rituals, just memory, voice, and witness. And always the chains, not as symbols of punishment but of remembrance. Of the stories buried. Of the truth spoken. Of the girl who was blamed, broken, buried, and who became the voice of a village. I was the first girl they chained beneath the whispering ground. They said I brought drought. That my laughter curled the maize into withered fists. That my mother's death, my father's blindness, all of it was born from my silence. But I was only quiet because I listened. They never knew what I heard. Not the rustle of banana leaves or the cries of hyenas near the hills. I listened to footsteps, tones of breath, the tremble before lies. I heard my uncle poison the well with bitterroot because he lost a bet. I heard the priest's wife bury her stillborn child and weep alone. I heard truths no one wanted spoken. So they silenced me. I was only 17 when they took me to the hut. It smelled of wet bark and morning. They chained me in the dark, bones for company, damp earth my pillow. The chains were cruel at first, rough iron, cold and punishing. But at night they whispered. Others had come before me. Not all girls. Not all young. But all blamed. Each link carried a name, a sorrow, a final breath. I learned their stories until mine joined them, not as screams but memory. For decades I lingered. Not as a ghost who howls, but one who listens still. I felt the centuries blur. Muta Nyoka forgot our names. They built new huts over old sins. They called the chains cursed, not sacred. They burned herbs, slaughtered goats, and whispered fear into children, but no one listened to the earth anymore. Until Asina. I knew her the moment her feet touched the floor above me. Her silence wasn't fear, it was weight. She carried listening in her bones. Her tears that first night, I remember them well. Not for their sound but for the way they fell in rhythm. They sang. And so we sang back. We didn't rush her. We knew the sting of trust too soon broken. We whispered slow, names, years, betrayals. The night she heard mine she didn't flinch. She simply nodded. I felt that nod echo through every link. Each night she lit us. Her memory became our bonfire. I watched her change. Not like fire changes wood, but like water shapes stone. She began speaking to us. Not loudly, never that. A whisper, a hum, a steady promise. She asked questions others feared. She wondered why truth must bleed. She remembered us, and that remembering stitched something whole in the broken dark. When the ground began to hum, when the roots above curled like protective fingers, I knew she had become more than a girl. She was a vessel. I followed her dreams, hovered at the edge of her breath. In sleep, I told her secrets I never dared in life, how the stars mourned us, how the river once turned red for a girl named Imk, how bones can carry songs. She listened to it all. And when her time came, when the thunder cracked and the chains lifted, I did not cry. I sang her name. The earth moved for her. The air parted. She rose, glowing like the moon's forgotten twin. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. Because forward she carried us. Now from this place, not darkness, not light, but something older, I watch. I watch as the children are born with the chain mark on their wrists. I watch as the shrine is built, not of stone, but of stories. I watch elders hesitate before lying, as if the wind might carry their words to the one who listens. And I feel peace. Because we are not forgotten. Because Asina heard us, and now others hear through her. I no longer need to whisper. I fade not into silence but into song, carried by the lips of those who finally, truly listen.